What if the very laws you were taught to follow are actually keeping you from the very life that you're meant to live? So, if you have ever felt like you're checking all the boxes, so to speak, then this episode 101 of Love Learning You is for you. I'm Justine Gonzalez, author, speaker, and cultural psychology researcher. I'm also your hostess here at Love Learning You. And I love to get compassionately curious about how culture, beliefs, and systems shape our inner world, not just mine, not just yours, not just some people's, all of ours. And my intention in this episode is not to give you more rules. It's to actually help you see the invisible ones that might be guiding your life without your consent. So stay with me to the end. We are going to connect spiritual laws, cultural norms, algorithms, and how you are one in 300 million in your soul journey. And I want us to dive into learning about liberation in different ways because it has helped me so much in my journey. So let me turn down my song here and make sure that you can hear me. We have our little intro there, but this is Laws for Living a Life of Liberation, episode 101. I'm trying some new things with live streams, so stay with me here and welcome. I connected my LinkedIn. We will see if it works. Okay, so I'm going to first get into laws. I saw somebody post about these laws, and I keep seeing so much regurgitation, as we all do in a lot of these media platforms, because so many have discovered the power of using systems of artificial intelligence. So I want to go through this post that I saw, and it said 7 laws for living a life that is liberated. And my very first pondering was, I wonder who is behind these laws. So first, I'm going to give you those laws because it intrigued me, and I thought, I want to look a little deeper. So the first one was Kidlin's, and it was a law that states that clearly articulating a problem can lead to solving it. And so this particular principle or law emphasizes the power of clarity when we are enhancing productivity and problem solving. There's a few things I want you all to look for as we go through these laws and as I introduce you to some ancestral and spiritual laws as well, laws of nature, and how we look at these things comparatively, because I'm actually modeling for you a think aloud in this episode of what is going inside my brain as a cultural psychology researcher for years when I'm seeing things like this, or I see quotes. And often what I see happening is in our current climate, in the rapid use of AI, we are not going through and actually then saying, but what do I believe about this? And what are the laws that I'm allowing to just seemingly govern my own life? So Pareto's law, it states that 80% of results originate from 20% of the efforts. I think a lot of people are familiar with the 80-20 rule, so to speak, and it's been replicated through health programs, productivity, etc. Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And it's highlighting the importance of anticipating potential failure. So one of the things I was noticing as I was looking through these particular 7 that somebody had shared on a post was how they're framed. And often the language pattern I saw was very negative. It was basically planning for the worst and not looking at all that could go right. So I'm just pointing that out. That was already my noticing by the 4th law. Wilson's law asserts that prioritizing knowledge and intelligence naturally leads to financial success. This principle encourages individuals to invest in their personal and professional growth. I think this comes from like a bunch of influencer culture. That was my initial thought. Gilbert's law emphasizes the importance of responsibility in achieving desired outcomes. It also asserts that finding effective methods for tasks is ultimately up to the individual. An individual-based law. These seem pretty Eurocentric to me. Okay, Falkland's law. Falkland's law emphasizes the importance of decision-making restraint, suggesting that if a decision is not necessary, it is better to postpone it. Avoid unnecessary complications. Don't make a thing out of it. I've been told that before. So as I'm going through, right, I'm also, this is my bias, I'm going, are these all men? Are these all European men? What's the origin of these supposed laws? Okay, so all of that just from a social media post where somebody had declared, live these 7 laws if you want a better life. Okay, all right, well, I didn't buy into it. I said, let me look into all this. And then Hick's law states that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number of choices. Now, this is going to come back at the end today because I prepared kind of a crosswalk, so to speak, of how so many laws that govern us and our own cultural norms and how we choose to unpack those consistently actually shows up in how our algorithms and our feeds are being magnified in our faces. Okay, so we'll get that to the end. But this is an interesting one to note with that because it's actually the principle of a lot of technology frameworks, and they are built upon deep psychological knowledge as well as programming knowledge, ability of mainstream programming of people's brains, of what gets in front of them and how it gets in front of them, how it becomes institutionalized, that this is very known. So keep that in mind when you go into your favorite GPT, whether that's Claude or through OpenAI, ChatGPT, all these different systems that are LLMs, they're very binary. They're based on very often like very one lens frameworks that are not considering a broad perspective of lived human experiences. So when you see people talk about the use of AI, or we see all these arguments for and against, outside of all of that, Facebook, even social media platforms, they're designed to actually enhance this law. Whoever Hicks is, and we'll learn at the end, not at the end, but here in a few slides, but they know, those who create technology, which is why you read so many things historically as to why Steve Jobs said, I would never give my child a phone. Okay, so like the creator of Apple, quote unquote, like in all those things, that they make it very known they would never. But this also, it impacts options on your decision making efficiency, and there's a reason why some of you might feel a lot of brain fatigue and overwhelm and have for a number of years. So here's where I went to. Who are these people? What I found, let me go ahead and take myself off. Let me come back to the stage, and I'll move back in just a minute to the slides so that we can keep it moving. The reason I wanted to model this first section of the episode around And just for reference, cultural psychology is a newer vein of psychology in the past few decades. And cultural psychology examines not just the basis of where thoughts of belief structures, value structures, norm structures come from in humans, but it also examines how the neurological, so our neural pathways is also another branch called cultural neuroscience, how the psychology of culture and those beliefs, norms, values, our language usage, our symbols, how those actually influence the psychology and actions behind the brain, and then into the deeper neuroscience of it. So I'm kind of speaking in very broad layman's terms, but in a nutshell, you're going to find some pretty standard people across the board, whether we're looking at Afrocentric, Asian-centric, Eurocentric, or indigenous centric. No matter what models or theories you're looking at, there's still a lot to be done for bridging a lot of these worlds and understanding how we as humans experience nuance, how we can understand paradox in our lives and hold that, because so many of us, we walk through our lives and we don't realize, we do not awaken or become conscious to the fact that we all have very big perspective, and we can have access to that on a universal and cosmic level. But then we also have these very defined worlds and the structures that have been built by the past thousands of years of systems. And a lot of those, not a lot, they're created by men. And I mean humans, perpetuated by all humans. We'll come back to that. Okay. Let me add our slides back to the stage. And so this first example is really just how I tend to examine and think about things. Often we are mindlessly scrolling, and I saw this and I said, well, that's interesting, but these kind of seem like all white dudes. And that's me making an assumption. I'm not telling you if that's good or bad, but to not examine what goes through your mind, whether it's in situations or conversations, and then say, well, that's just how everyone thinks. That's not okay. Like, it's just not okay to live your life that way. And you're actually, the person you're hurting the most is yourself when you don't open up perspective. So then I said, let me go down some of my research and my path in my life, and let me see what I can share with people for how not only I study, but I try to bridge these worlds. And if you've watched, I'll link a couple below, but one video in particular where I share one video that in particular where I share a lot about bridging worlds for myself and why this is just so much a part of who I am is called Uncovering Your Cultural Origin Story. And for me, I talk a lot about being a third culture kid born in the United States of America. There are many American countries across South America and North America. So United States is just one small country in all of the different American countries that exist across both regions. So because a lot of also my PhD research involved understanding the change management process in schools that were historical areas of the Midwest United States that were governed by the law of the KKK. And what I mean by that is you had full governments, bodies of government, and laws that were being upheld, and still to this day in United States government in particular, that it's how it's been for thousands of years because it's the same core bloodlines holding power. And you see this replicated in all cultures across the world. You see it replicated in humanity because all humans experience suffering and all humans experience these challenges of choosing, do I choose the self? Do I choose the collective? So often in cultural training arenas or cultural competence work, you may have heard these terms, high context and low context cultures. You can also see that displayed across language development and evolution, the migration of peoples and how we group together. And that is because those terms have to do with how we communicate and the cultural norms that we live by. Those are both very broad buckets, but I want to highlight then, okay, if people are circulating, and I see this often with like the bro and influencer culture. And I see that across, I use bro culture for women too, by the way, because you're still pandering to patriarchy. You're still pandering to systems of hierarchy and like the formula of I'll be good enough if. Well, I can do it if I meet this metric. So let's look at a little difference, okay, through indigenous and ancestral spiritual laws for liberation. One would be from Ubuntu, which is African philosophy, and simply put, very commonly known, I am because we are. And the source of that is a lot of Southern African Bantu philosophy, and it's also connected a lot to ancient Egyptian Maat, which is truth, justice, harmony, balance, and reciprocity. So the whole principle of Ubuntu is your humanity is tied to the humanity of others. It truly is the heart of a collective spirit. So when we think about division in the world, when we think about conquest in Los Conquistadores de Spain, right? Spain, I mean, pillaged and murdered so much of the world. I'm saying that as a person with like some percentage of Spanish blood. And I'm saying this as a person who has DNA from like 18 regions around the world. Part of the reason this work is so vital for so many of us is because my generation and younger, especially in the United States, we are the remnants of all of the mixing of not only Eurocentric, not only African, not only Caribbean or Latino or Native American or Asian. We are all these things, but we were also raised and birthed into a very capitalistic and patriarchal society structure and governance structure. And I'm speaking specifically to United States context. So often, because of how media is owned and run or healthcare is owned and run, you can live your whole life in an isolated state, perhaps through a couple of generations. And it is why I believe the scriptures exist that say, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. I think that even in biblical times and in the times of ancient scriptures in general, you had seers and oracles and prophets who knew there will be people who will be misled by the lies of men. Could be interchangeable with the laws of men. I don't know. So because of that, I wanted to examine if I were going to help others unpack what I've unpacked in my own life, how I've tried to rectify even my own internal dissonance of this like horror of learning and tracing genealogy in my family. And it could go either way: villain, victor, oppressed, oppressor, across the board, all my bloodlines. So because of that, and I'm not saying that I'm special. No, I'm saying that's the whole sentiment behind what I do. I want to give you access to learning what are the laws you live by? What's your code for living? So the biggest difference when you often see, and it unfortunately was boiled into a very simplistic but vile structure, racial empire logic, which is all based on if we code people according to the colors or shades of the melanin in their skin, they will automatically associate psychologically white with a certain thing and black with a certain thing, even though those aren't really people's skin colors ever. Like, so even that reality, when you look at when it came in as a geopolitical construct, a socio-political construct, and how it's used to not only divide, this concept is going to come back up. And it's because it was easy. It was very easy to create a construct that would pit how some of the world thought, which was very individual, and against a majority, which was actually more collectivism. And indigenous, Afrocentric, it's much more community culture. Let's go to the next one. Maat, the 7 cardinal virtues, which is ancient Egyptian and African, ancient Kemetic, which is Egyptian spirituality, foundational to African ethics. And those 7 values, and you saw them highlighted briefly on the last slide, are truth, justice, propriety, harmony, balance, reciprocity, and order. I also just realized, I don't think I connect. No, there's a chat here. Okay. So the principle of this is living in alignment with cosmic and moral order brings liberation. So when we disrupt justice or propriety or harmony or balance or reciprocity, then we create chaos and suffering. So it contends that we are the proponents of that. And if those things are happening, it's because we are creating them by not seeking truth, justice, harmony, balance, reciprocity. And that can be really, really hard in a world that has been designed to keep you fixated and focused on division and how different you are from other people that are not like you, how much you need to buy in order to feel worthy, how many degrees or titles you need, or how much money you need. That's capitalism. And that is also baked into patriarchy, which is, of course, built around the centering of men, as opposed to matriarchal societies, which tend to be more indigenous and Afrocentric. And that it is built around the centering of the mother and the woman, the matriarchal figure. And it doesn't mean she's not of service. It doesn't mean that she's pillaging and all powerful. It means that you honor the sacred life source that comes from the divine feminine. And we all have divine feminine and masculine within us, by the way. Okay, next one. Another indigenous and ancestral spiritual law for liberation, the 7 grandfather teachings. This is going to come back up. I'm a 7th generation principle thinker myself, and this comes from Anishinaabe and Native American wisdom. And this source comes from an idea of widely shared wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, truth, these pillars. It's widely across indigenous North American teachings. And the principle is that the natural laws that guide right relationship with yourself, others, and all of creation, and that these are natural and inherent to planet Earth. They're embodied by animal spirits, and they remind us that spiritual laws are embedded in nature itself. So for example, I could see that in the evolution and life cycle of a tree, and even an examination of each of its parts, whether it's the trunk, the roots, the leaves, the stems, seedlings, whatever. I could also compare that to any process in my own life. I could also see the causal relationships of suffering and what happens if that tree doesn't get water or nourishment. If that tree is battered over and over and told it's not good enough, quote unquote, by the conditions of the weather itself. For example, you get where I'm going. You see the parallels. Okay, next. Dharma, which is from Hindu and Vedic philosophy, is right action and duty. And so the foundational concept of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism is dharma, and it means cosmic law, moral duty, righteous living. And it's a principle that each person has a unique dharma, that your soul has a dharma, a sacred duty aligned with your purpose of your soul. And liberation comes not from avoiding that responsibility. So you see, this is counterintuitive to, let's go back to it. Who said to avoid? I'm pretty sure it was Hicks and Hyman, the psychology researchers. So let's go back to it. Hang on. Oh no, it was Falkland. It was Falkland. And he was the English statesman, I believe. And basically, that's counterintuitive. So you start to see, as you look at patterns, as you look at the principles and quote unquote, the laws of man that guide, or rather the laws of the cosmos and the universe. There's a difference, right? That man is now confined to just what man is. If I'm living by the laws of the cosmos and the universe, that's a perspective versus just my perception as a human having a very human experience. So you can start to see how these are very, very different. And this is that we're all embedded, we're all interconnected. So it goes, it's counterintuitive to, for example, we're asking with Dharma, what is your calling? Not society's script. It also says that liberation doesn't come from avoiding that responsibility, yet Falkland said to avoid when possible. Okay, but from acting in alignment with your true nature. I can't help but think if some of the people who are heralded as the modern day fathers of thought, of psychology, of wisdom, and I'm going down a strictly Eurocentric path, because there's often the proclamation that this is the way, this is the principle, and then not considering the whole rest of the world. that is why the term Eurocentric or things like racial empire logic exists, because then other kingdoms and other races and cultures have latched onto the same theory. And if we don't dismantle from that right now in this moment too, we all could potentially recreate the same harm by clumping thought into very, very broad categories. So, anyways, I'm just saying when you start to look at these, you can understand why there's so much division in our world. And I can't help but wonder if there's a lot of intentional forces that have tried to confuse, almost like a Tower of Babel situation, so to speak, but they've tried to confuse truth with half truths with baked in lies. There's, I'll link an article I wrote about that and what it's actually called and the terminology behind it through Afrocentric psychology and liberation theories. And you can read more about that. So let's keep it going. There's also moksha, which is Hindu Vedic philosophy, and it's liberation from the cycle. And one of the four goals of life in Hinduism, or Purusharthas, represents freedom from samsara, or the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. So I'm just talking about that tree and the cycles of birth, death, rebirth, and suffering. Well, true liberation, according to moksha, is release from that attachment, desire, fear, and ego. It's union with the divine and eternal bliss. You're in a body, having a body experience as a human, but underneath that all, you've always been a soul, always been a soul. And so freedom in this respect, if I'm following this law, freedom comes when you stop identifying with the material and remember your eternal essence, plain and simple. Okay. Now on these slides, you might also see how it enhances your laws. I'm going to give you 5 laws, but they're not actual laws. They're actual, like, these all combined for you to actually unpack and create your own code of living for yourself. Okay. No one else to tell you. The next one is Ashe, the concept of Ashe, and that comes from Yoruba, which highly influenced Caribbean, Santeria, Voodoo, Hoodoo, Ifa tradition, life force and creative power. That is, in a nutshell, Ashe is life force and creative power. So in Yoruba spiritual philosophy from West Africa, and Yoruba is one of the main tribes in Nigeria, and it was carried to the Caribbean throughout the transatlantic slave trade, and which was led by Europeans to the Americas. And then it was central to Santeria, Voodoo, Hoodoo. And then you see a lot of this replicated. And part of my heritage is Arawak or Taino from Boricuan or modern day Puerto Rico. The principle is that Ashe is the vital energy that flows through all things. It can be cultivated, shared, and directed through ritual, ethical living, and alignment with the Orishas, which are divine spirits in this tradition. Your words, your actions, and intentions carry Ashe. So basically, if we put it into simple terms, what you give your attention to, you give your Ashe to. It's your life force, your creative energy. So when algorithms and oppressive systems, right, they try to claim that life force. And that's what I think we kind of see starting to happen. We're at the beginning of this happening, where we start to see a lot of confusion, a lot of division, a lot of distraction, and it's being ramped up. So let's get into what that actually means. This final one I also took from is just a respect for ancestors and the natural world. And I took this specifically from part of my own culture, and that is Taino spiritual philosophy of the Caribbean. And it emphasizes reverence for Zemi, which is ancestral and natural spirits. Me personally, I do not put other gods before Yahweh or Elohim. But I do recognize the power, influence, and force of the natural and the spiritual, and many of the things that maybe as humans we cannot always see with our eyes, but we can feel, and we have faith and belief to experience. It's really this idea of the interconnectedness of all life, and going back to this 7th generation principle, understanding there were 7 and more generations before me, and there will be likely 7 generations after me. And when we think that way, we make decisions a little differently. There's also a lot of research that, and also examination of studying across centuries and intergenerational patterns, that it takes about 7 generations to break a cycle. So I want to leave that here because a lot of the principles that we get from Native practices, specifically Native American and Caribbean practices that are indigenous, the earth, the ancestors, and the spirit world, they're not separate from you. And this is how I have always experienced my own life. So it's been hard for me to, I guess, kind of rectify when then I was brought up in a very fundamentalist church. So I've seen both sides and I've experienced both. And that's partly why I felt called to do a lot of the research I have, because I had so much of my own internal things to figure out, and just try to always connect with the spirit of the living God and say, help me today to better understand your love and your peace and your presence, and let me understand that. So I don't look at a lot of things as separate in my life. I've struggled with algorithms because of that, because it's all interconnected to me. And then I'm seeing how these systems work. I also have a brain for data. So I'm seeing how these things work. And it's like, wait. No, people, why are you saying like that's the gospel truth now? No. But to me, liberation includes honoring those who came before and those who will come after, and recognizing that we are just a thread in a sacred eternal web. I like to think of it as our DNA ladders, among other things, because we're always leaving our footprints behind. So I have this thing, especially when I started doing more stuff with podcasting and media, that I saw so many influencers, especially in the Americas, that are like, I'm self-made. And I'm always like, I cannot stand it. It's like one of my biggest pet peeves when people say they're self-made, because I don't fundamentally believe that about myself or anyone. You're not self-made. There are things that have influenced your life, whether you wanted them to or not, whether you label them as good or bad or not, but you are not self-made, sweeties. I have no other way to say it, but that really, it really has bothered me. And I see that as a very common thing with like patriarchal, capitalistic, like kind of bro and influencer type cultures. And that's what we've seen a lot of with my generation in particular, millennials. So deciding. So now it's like, okay, you gave us like all this stuff. You gave us stuff to think about, Justine. Yeah, I did. Let's round it out and come up with, how do you do this for you? How do you understand where you stand with something? Why do you believe what you believe? And sometimes we have these deciding moments in our own inner law, and we realize in those moments, oh my goodness, I've never examined this. This is a really difficult decision. So sometimes we're confronted with decisions and they're kind of like, okay, I know this is right for my life, but then it doesn't match the norms or the expectations or like the shoulds of your family and your church, your workplace, your culture that you were brought up in, etc. But your body, your intuition, your desire, they already know. But you already know the decision you're supposed to make. This is actually where liberation starts. Not because you're ignoring rules, but when you start to ask, whose laws am I actually following right now? And why am I following them? And there's a lot to unpack, because our world has been designed and kind of ruled for the past few thousand years by these really, really harmful, oppressive laws that are not actually intended to provide freedom. And unfortunately, what happens is there are people who are very devoted and they want to do great work, whether that is they're in law or they are a politician, whatever. And they get sucked up in these same lies because these lies have been so effective psychologically for making people, humans, feel awful about who they are and that they are not able to somehow choose their own path. So who wrote these rules? When I think about cultural norms, one facet of our own cultural identities, the norms that we live by, you need to start asking yourself, who wrote these rules? Okay, so the story that we're often told over and over, whether that's in school, I'm a former K-12 teacher, principal, and superintendent. This is 1,000% of how we're indoctrinated from the time we start school. Okay, the story we're told over and over is that we are more divided than ever. And those divisions are not accidental. So anytime you start to see these narratives, which they are super, super prevalent at the current moment, and they have been for a number of years, for really as long as time, since time began. But I will say that because we haven't always had media on the scale we have. And when media scale was introduced, it was controlled. And a lot of this stuff happened during World War II. Okay. And like leading up to it. And it was very intentional, and it's been led by very specific groups of people. Okay. The divisions aren't accidental. They're reinforced through the systems, policies, education, religion, and language that tell us who belongs, who has power, and who needs to be managed, fixed, or measured. So when the question becomes the laws of man or the laws of nature, which is kind of how I started this whole episode to frame up and let you go on that same journey with me. What were your reactions? Pause me, and examine and go back and write. What did I react to with that law? Wait, when she introduced this one, this is what resonated though. Wait a minute, hang on, ask yourselves. I tend to think that the laws of nature, I personally believe, are deeply spiritual laws. And then are the laws written in unexamined cultural conditioning? Are a lot. So I found this in my own journey. When I've done a lot of deconstruction work through the years, like I just don't, so much of our laws aren't actual laws. They're just cultural conditioning to get you prepared for a workforce, which is really like a enslavement model. That's it. So you're working for a different system or purpose, basically. So we're going to keep going down that trail of what that means for you and how you can liberate yourself. The brain, categories, and one more thing. So here's a little note about cultural neuroscience and specifically just the brain. Our human brains love categories, and we love categorizing because it helps us make meaning. The people who are running things, meaning healthcare industries, media industries, finance industries, and then institutional. So higher ed, K-12, education, religion, etc. Anything that influences people greatly. All of this actually goes back to workforce and like in the US Department of Labor in a lot of ways right now, because that is the only thing that matters to our government is how much money that they can make. And then for the wealthy and elite, how much they can actually just grab for themselves. So because of that, and that is how our society is, it's how it was built from quote unquote the founding fathers. They didn't found anything. There was already millions of people here and plenty of cultures and societies and existing laws. The original American Constitution from the Iroquois, by the way, as well, which was also developed on seventh generation principles. So all of that to say, those who are controlling minds and are the foremost psychologists, the foremost medical researchers, et cetera. And you see this coming specifically from European and or United States, American, Canadian context, which were heavily Eurocentric. We also see this come up in the Americas a lot because of Spain and Portugal's influences, and also their hands, as well as Italian influences stemming from Holy Roman Empire, and then all of their hands involved in the domination specifically of Africa and specifically colonization across the globe. These were large-scale efforts. They were replicated across India, attempted across Australia, and you see there's been a lot of action taken through the years to try to reclaim a lot of indigenous practices, specifically if you look at the Maori peoples of New Zealand and Australia and other indigenous tribes, blah, blah, blah. I could keep going, but all you're going to find replicated, and it all stems from Eurocentric seated thinking. Doesn't mean that if your skin tone is like this or if you are not. They want you to go through those layers of guilt and shame. And a racial caste system is another way to create guilt and shame for not being enough in some way. Okay? So there's a pivotal point that's been happening in our history the past 10, 15 years or so too. So because we know this about the brain, when new synapses form, we're deciding what goes where. So often, if we've been brought into the world going good, bad, normal, that's just naturally how the subconscious is going to process information. So because of that, human behavior is often highly predictable, even our distress patterns. So that meltdown you have when you're 45 or 55 years old, it's going to look a lot like a toddler tantrum. It's just with more sophisticated language and better vocabulary. But sometimes that in it of itself is what has taken us away from understanding who we are, is getting language that doesn't actually name it, which is why I call not racism, I call it racial empire logic, what we're discussing. That has been now impressed upon generations, and it is on each of us to undo harmful or oppressive structure, systems, and thinking that has been passed on to us, just as it is on each of us if we know alcoholism runs in our family, or if we know stealing runs in our family, if we know colonizing runs in our family. What do we have to go unpack? All of these are spiritual things in nature. All of these are generational and interlocked in nature. Those things don't just disappear because great granddaddy's dead. Those things don't just disappear because abuela da 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 da. Those happenings, they live within us because our DNA is connected. So even if you want to get into the epigenetics trail, you're going to find reinforcement as to why you have to establish and unpack your own things. No one can do that for you. And our society has been created to let you think and believe that just trust us. We know better. Your pastor, trust me, I'll tell you the truth. No, they might want your pocketbook. I don't know. Like, that could not be true too. I don't know. Right. So like, you have to ask yourself, am I just blowing this up to something and using different words? And the truth is, I've been there. I am there. Like, there are times I realize I'm melting down over something that requires absolutely no meltdown. Why am I melting down? But that's also one of the most beautiful paradoxes of being human. We get to notice these patterns. We get to unwrap them like a gift, and we get to decide how we want to work with them in this big, big journey that we call life, and in this big, big universe outside of just planet Earth, right? So to bring it all back to why we're here and why I want you to love learning you, not just about celebrities and other people. I want you to love learning you because you're 1 in 300 million. Okay, let me get my voice under control. But in one ejaculation, there are roughly 300 million sperms. So I'm going to give you the science. I love the spirituality aspects, and I also do study theology, and I have for many, many years, actually decades since I was a child, because I was raised fundamentalist. So another story for another day. You are literally 1 in 300 million. So there are roughly 300 million sperm that are ejaculated. And so you are the one who made it here in this exact body, in this exact moment of history. Now, you might be laughing a little with me, and I just wanted to throw in something to also make sure we're chuckling and not taking ourselves too seriously. But that's the truth, though, too. So on your worst days, when you're looking around like, nobody understands what it's like to be me, and all of us go there. I don't care who you are or how you look or how you sound today. All of us go there and we go, well, nobody understands what it's like to be me. I do it all the time. And then I'm like, bitch, shut up. Okay. Now you get an idea of how I also rein in. Like, you have an inner critic. Many people know the terms inner critic and inner child. But what you don't know is you also have an inner bad bitch. And I don't care if you're gender. But it's kind of that kind of like you're like a mama or an abuela figure, and they're roping you back in. So you need to get real. It's your get real voice. And so maybe you have another name. That's okay. But I always know when she's coming out because it's the truth. And I might not want to hear that ugly truth, but that's usually the voice where it's me being rational and getting out of that emotional state. Maybe I still haven't processed the emotions of that particular situation, conversation, whatever, But then I can also hear that voice of reason to go, zoom out. What? Hang on. So the biggest lies, though, then of the systems like white supremacy, racial empire logic, okay, patriarchy, exploitative capitalism, are that you're not enough. You're not worthy. You're not valuable if or until you prove yourself through degrees, productivity, appearance, or performance. So, especially in institutions of education and religion, many of us have experienced them all over the world. So I'm not just speaking about Christianity. I'm not just speaking about Judaism. I'm not just speaking about Buddhism or Hinduism, because here's the reality, or spirituality. I don't care if you're like who you are. These are, if we're part of systems and structures and we've lived in the world, and there are those who have not, right? So there are many, many closed cultures around the world that exist as well. There are many rural areas that exist around the world with very specific dialects, very specific people groups and norms. Those things exist too. Not a lot of access to technology or even modern day things, or things that we would consider modern. But for the most part, the whole world is born and experiences education and religion. And these became institutions and more standardized specifically to support capitalism through the years, and also just empire in general. And it's why women and many men, for the most part, especially even if you look at biblical times, like they weren't taught to read and write. Okay, so these laws that were harmful and oppressive, and even when the Bible would have been translated, not the original scrolls from Ethiopia, and looking into the original Sudanese church, like whatever you study is what you study. I'm going through my own lens and context. But there are many, many ancient scriptures beyond that. And one of those I speak about a lot is because there's so many factions, over 45,000 of Christianity. I grew up in a couple different westernized versions of that through a fundamentalist lens. And it's intriguing and also shocking to me how intentional the language of guilt and shame repetitively are to code and categorize. I call it cultural coding, how you view God and how you view power. And so these were conflated not only through those systems, but then even conflated with the transatlantic slave trade, and even having like a slave Bible versus a quote unquote regular Bible. So when you look at all these intricacies, I'm giving very minimal examples. There's so many. We have to look and read. You not need to rely on AI for these types of things, because these systems are not being, for the most part, not being generated by those who want to honor other perspectives of the global majority. Europeans, those who identify as white Europeans, or that origin within white Americans, they make up maybe 8 to 10% of the global population, maybe. And that's how it's always been. So you got to also look at the inverse of that, not because it's like you're going to lose now. No. And I'm saying that to anybody who would watch this. It doesn't need to be that way. You don't have to oppress other people to feel better about yourself. You don't have to say shitty things to other people to feel better about yourself. And this is what our systems, unfortunately, education and religion, have in a very sophisticated way, have painted an idea of power through bastardizing God and the word of God, Bible, which many people believe that to be, and then doing the same thing to just block out any other thought or concept and brainwash massive numbers of people. It's helped evangelize those lies, and it's through policy, it's through very distinct practices. And a lot of times we don't even realize that that's happened, and it takes somebody saying something to point it out. And the question becomes, for us, do I believe what I believe because it's true to my soul, because it is how we should treat one another, because it's loving, or because it's what I was repeatedly taught to think? Do I believe what I believe because it's true to my soul, or because it's what I was repeatedly taught to think. And notice thinking and believing are two different words, two totally different concepts. But beliefs paint how we ultimately think and our mental models and how we conceptualize the world and see it until we open up new neural pathways. And that does take a level of getting out of our comfort zones to actually ignite new neural pathways after the brain has fully developed and formed. So let's bring it into something we can all relate to right now. And I kept saying I'm going to bring it back full circle before this episode ends. We are almost at time, but algorithms, shame loops, and mental slavery. So every day we feel algorithms. And when you say, my feed is all rage bait, or now my whole feed is brownie recipes because I just searched one thing, like a brownie recipe. So what you're noticing is pattern psychological programming. And this has been in the works for decades. And this is how the algorithms are built and developed. And it's built upon studying previously decades of human brain. So there's also this whole other thing, and we won't go down all those trails today. The reason why I presented a very broader concept of laws and what they mean around the world and how they show up in our lives as cultural norms and the beliefs that we operate by, I painted it that way to just show even just a minimal scale of how many perspectives and lived experiences there are and how much we discount ourselves when we only rely on one way of thinking, or we say, oh, well, yeah, this is what it is. No, none of us really know. We're all having very human experiences, whether we want to believe that or not. And we're also all very spiritual because we have a soul. That's a reality. So because we then have talked a little bit about how the human brain has been studied mainly by, as far as documented and shared broadly, that's been done mainly by European and European descended people, as well as United States Americans. But that's only because there's certain families, and companies attached to them that dominate everything on an elite wealth scale. And racial empire logic is one of those mechanisms, like we've talked about today, that actually perpetuates inequalities, oppression, the oppressed and the oppressor. And I think that so many people I speak with now, they're waking up to this. But how that looks then modern day algorithm, because there's so much brain research and we know that the brain categorizes and how it thinks, and it's very predictable. So because that neuroscience has existed, that's how so many of these tech algorithms were built, to be repeated patterns of dependency and then emotional triggering. And it's at scale and it's at speed. So they can keep you even longer than a Sunday and Wednesday service at church. But I'm being serious. They can keep you in a loop of shame way longer than that teacher or that pastor, because it's always on your feed across every platform. And that's what those tracking systems help do. That's why no matter what, I always have privacy settings. They're on lock, and it's also no apps can track my activities. So you want to be very clear on those things and why those guardrails actually legally have to exist, and make sure that you know your rights. But from a deeper psychological standpoint, and being a cultural psychology researcher, having survived growing up in a fundamentalist church background, coming from Amish and Mennonite and also Puerto Rican roots, okay? I'm letting you know this is really, 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 really powerful. And I went into even my area of research as a PhD to help me unlearn some very imprinted patterns that all go back to this: shame, guilt, rage. Shame, guilt, rage. And guess what? When you're also never taught, like you're taught that emotions are bad and just stuff them down and just forget about it, it's fine, God will take care of it. But you're not given tools to name, identify, or share what you've experienced and then know how to clear that emotion. How does that manifest? Lots of ways. I can tell you many. And we then repeat and project to others in our worlds. Unfortunately, that's when we can become both victim and villain. So this idea of being both a victim and villain to a system, you don't have to stay in either. You don't have to stay in either category. It doesn't have to be binary like an LLM. Okay. It doesn't have to be at all. And so much of religion and educational institutions are built on a very binary thought. And that isn't how humans are. And I don't care if you're Amish Puerto Rican like me and have all these different background of DNA and you want to study all that. No, I want to study all of it because I didn't have a choice. I've been explaining who I am and explaining myself and trying to explain myself since I was a kid, and I shouldn't have had to do that. I shouldn't have had to correct teachers. I shouldn't have had to say, hey, you don't talk to kids that way just because they don't speak English. Yeah, as a kid. So when you start to notice those things, you feel it for a reason. And going all the way back to this slide at the very beginning where I talked about we all have this turning point. I said it in the opening where we get these turning points in life where we go and we get that feeling that almost kind of bubble up in our stomach and we get a little nervous, or maybe you get a little warm, or you get a little flushed with your skin or whatever. And it's that defining moment. Like, am I going to say and stand up for what I really believe? Am I going to call out that behavior that somebody asserted against me? Like in that meeting, am I going to say it to my colleague? They shouldn't have said that. Whatever those things are that happen, and it feels like a big turning point, even if it's not actually a big event or moment itself, it feels that way because we're determining, am I going to keep perpetuating this cycle? And sometimes, yes, many, that's the reconciliation process that I believe many, specifically Eurocentric thinking people, and specifically Americans, we have to recognize that it is on us to unlearn harmful generational patterns. And that isn't just overeating. It's not just drug use. It's not just alcohol. It's not just abuse. It's not just sexual patterns. It's not just violence. Whatever fill in the blank thing that a church or religious institution might say, that's a generational sin or that's a generational pattern. You have to also look at the same and know, yes, and if you had Confederate soldiers in your bloodlines, if you had whatever those things are that you find, if you shut down because you're already so embarrassed or you feel so much guilt and shame, do you think that the human nature is going to tend to move towards what's uncomfortable? Absolutely not. Because it's hard to admit that we're wrong. It's hard to admit the pains or the sins of the father, so to speak. So over time, from a vibrational, if we're looking at frequencies, all humans, we have a frequency that we vibrate at. So if we, what does that result in? And then we see it for generations, okay? Violent language, emotional numbness, conflict in relationships, and a constant feeling of being dysregulated or exhausted, or like you've been hijacked. That means that there's things you got to clear. There's things you got to clear. Okay. So when communication psychology and neuroscience are dominated by just Eurocentric or colonizer mindsets or racial empire logic, and if you're still making it about a skin color, you're going to miss the point of this. That's not what any of that means. It means that was created as a surface level system to get you to think it was you and you should feel bad about how you look. Okay. And now it's working in an opposite pendulum because you have a lot of specifically those who identify as white Americans. They're now very embarrassed or ashamed or not wanting to do work. That's probably a normal thing, and it doesn't help you. It doesn't help any of your generations. But it's a normal thing, quote unquote, for any of us to feel shame about having to confront something in our bloodlines or something that we see within ourselves that we don't want to see. That does feel like shame. But shame makes us believe that we're not accepted, and none of us is acceptable. Just that, and it's not just that part that maybe needs healing or fixing or a proclamation or praying a prayer of iniquity over our bloodlines type thing. So there are so many ways and paths you can take to actually start to love learning yourself. The unfortunate thing I see happening is that many systems are keeping people from not only loving themselves, but even beginning to start a process of even learning about themselves. So I don't want you all to get caught up in that. I want you to remember that even though these loops all serve the systems and not your liberation, your soul is still more powerful. And I'm not just saying that as a cliche. I'm saying it because it's divine design. And you're 1 in 300 million. Nobody can speak the way you do. Nobody can see the patterns exactly how you see them. And that's your liberation code. Those are your laws of liberation, not according to anybody else or what some oppressive system told you. So I say all of this to say, when you're working on yourself, when you're listening to that internal voice and you go, ooh, why did I have that reaction to what that person said? We all are experiencing that. We all are. And it doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes. It doesn't mean that you're not going to, unfortunately, we all hurt people. And a lot of times we don't know that we've hurt them with something we've said. Okay. Woo. All right. Almost here. Data, metrics, and the game we are playing. So let's talk about data, because I'm a data nerd and I have a nonprofit that's called Pro Teach AI Foundation. You might be thinking, what? Because I've done a lot of research around the human pattern of thinking and how the human pattern responds to different types of questions and what that gets us to acknowledge and accept about ourselves in the ways of anti-racist thinking and practices and behaviors, and understanding how we are all responsible and aware, and we can be aware of those things in our walk. But like anything, I love data because of the story it can tell and the insight it can give, but it can also be misused. And so we're in an era, and we have been, where data is rich and the meaning is very, very poor. So, for example, we chase higher school ratings or test scores, sales numbers, follower counts, and we don't usually stop to ask, well, why this metric and who chose it and what are we sacrificing to hit this number? Who does it serve, basically? So, for example, if your school's chasing a rating just to look better, or you're chasing a career goal just to feel enough, and I've been there actually in both of those situations, you might be playing someone else's game without realizing it. And that's really, really difficult if then your whole race is like, well, I'm here for kids. Because those two missions eventually and inevitably are going to clash if you're living your truth and you're not operating to play somebody else's game, but to do what's best for kids. And that's your game. And that's part of my story and what I've experienced through the years. So if we truly did understand the games we were playing, then we would probably choose a different game board, a different strategy, different players, like all around. And sometimes we just don't know. So this is what I've compiled for myself. I'm like, okay, well, what have you done specifically in the past like 15 years? So since I was 25 to 40. And these are the things that, either by way of my own mistakes and failures, my own learnings. My favorite life quotes I live by is from Nelson Mandela. I never lose, I either win or I learn. So these are contrived not just from victories and successes and, oh, I know it all. No, these are contrived from years of not only studying theology, working with a few key people that I really respect and admire across shamanism, prophecy, and different spiritual traditions around the world, but also my own journals and my own frameworks and things I've used now with teams for the past decade through different change management conundrums. So in the best ways, I would say start to notice, and even if you journal these as affirmations, it might sound corny, although this has been a big part of my own journey, but I really believe in that. And if you're struggling to believe something and you start writing it, you'll begin to believe it. And I'll give you an on steroids example. So even institutionalized, the reason why, like in the United States, it was such a big thing, or people wanted, media made it a big thing when Colin Kaepernick kneeled. It's not actually a big thing, because like I grew up in a lot of Amish communities, and like you never pledge allegiance to a flag or a country. And you never get in trouble for not standing or whatever. Like it was totally based on painting a bad picture, a continued perpetuated bad picture of Black men and all the ongoing racial division that has been carefully planned and heaped upon massively with media influence through the years. Massive campaigns that have been very intentional, specifically in the United States. But all of that to say, all of this, I just wanted to say, like, okay, if we see how easy it is for people to become indoctrinated just from saying a pledge, or all these little ways that it is regurgitating shame and guilt spirals, like when you hear a Sunday message at a religious institution or a Saturday message or whatever, what are all of the things, if I had to compile, and it would be these 5: the law of inner authority, conscious attention, sacred work, liberated data, and collective healing. And then under each, you can take a screenshot, whatever you need to do. But I commit to asking, whose voice is this? So when a belief rises up in me, so when I hear a belief rise up, I understand that culture can inform me, but it does not own my truth. So you don't have to be dictated just because you identify a belief and you go, oh, I never thought about that. It's like I think about this conversation I had with one of my colleagues who does some work in media. And she and I were just saying how we both like really struggle with, do you do things to your body as you get older, like little adjustments or not? And is that it being fully self-acceptant? I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I'm 41 and I have friends who are like, well, you still look great, so you should get Botox now. This is just a very prime example of the human experience. I didn't ask any of them that. And they're also all different backgrounds, by the way. I didn't ask them for that advice. I personally do not like medicines and stuff, and I've had very bad reactions to them through the years. So I've never wanted to do those things. I'd rather find natural oils and things that help my skin. But it's just a conversation point, right? One of so many things that comes in as like cultural conditioning and societal norms that have to do with beauty. And that's just one thing. And we wonder then, okay, well, why is this person suggesting this too? Because that's the way capitalism is. You know, you're a product, baby. So anyways, I know I'm just talking and talking here. So let's close out. But if I could encourage you to just do an exercise or anything, these are the things that I remind myself of and are my laws for living my life of liberation right now. They've been different through the years, but these are the actual, if I had to put a name to what is that thing when I'm noticing, because that's what I get asked a lot. When people go, but how did you become aware of that? Part of it is being birthed into a very bicultural home, growing up with 3 sets of grandparents. Like part of it is that. And that's why I want to share that gift with the world, because I had a lot of experiences even as a child and way before the age of 8, which is when your brain and your personality structure, everything is forming in you in a lot of ways from 0 to 10 years old. So it was never surprising to me. Like I loved teaching, never surprised to me that I went into teaching actually. But that was also birthed. You've heard me talk about why some of that was frustrating as a kid. And I felt like, but they're my teacher. And I know that they're making assumptions. And I know that they haven't been around lots of Latinos, like whatever reasons my parents would try to be like, okay, try to be understanding, like it's still confusing. And I'm just going to say that can be confusing for any kid, no matter your skin color and no matter your gender and no matter your orientation and. Okay. So I want you to pause after the video. And if you ask yourself nothing else, ask yourself and your soul, where am I still trying to prove my worth instead of living from the truth that I am already a miracle? So if you're ready to keep exploring cultural psychology, healing, and self-liberation, just make sure you subscribe here on Love Learning You. Hit the like button if this resonated and make sure you share it out if you have been a person who's been questioning the rules you were handed, or you're like, I want a different game. But let's keep getting compassionately curious together. This is my first solo Love Learning You. Episode 101 is my first solo of 2026. And if you haven't, make sure that you check out episode 100 with the lovely Marla Eccles, who is not only a children's book author, she's an award-winning teacher from the Department of Defense in both Spain and Bahrain. She has served numerous places, even outside of that, around the world. So I hope you check that interview out. And then I've also linked sources. So if you come back and watch this again, you can always take screenshots and you can see where I get some of my information from. I appreciate you all being here, and I am so glad that I got a chance to share just not only things that I'm passionate about, but honestly, things that I've unpacked, sometimes painfully in my own life. And I hope that we can continue walking each other home to our soul's true purpose, our soul's true calling. Take care. Until next time.